Today, we are continuing a worship series called Diverse by Design. At the heart of this series is the scriptural teaching that while God created the church to be unified, God never intended our unity to be based on uniformity. The community of faith was never meant to be a place where everyone thought the same, looked the same, and lived out their faith exactly the same as one another. Instead, it was supposed to be a place that honored the diversity of humanity and saw our differences not as a threat, but as a strength. Unfortunately, the modern church doesn't always reflect the reconciled community God created us to be. Instead of being a place of reconciling grace, churches are all too often just as divided as the world beyond our doors. Sometimes the forces of division are so strong, it feels like there is little, if any, hope that a diverse and inclusive church could ever really exist. But I believe that it can. I believe that if God has the power to defeat death, God has the power to help us overcome the divisions that are tearing us apart. What I'm going to do today is present a framework for how the reconciling grace of Christ can guide us beyond our disagreements and into a place where we not only tolerate our differences but celebrate them. The core of this concept comes from an anthropologist named Paul Hiebert. Hiebert believed that there are two ways people come together as groups. They are either bounded or they are centered. We will get to centered groups in a minute, but we are going to focus first on bounded groups. Bounded groups have clear boundaries. You are either in or you are out. To be in the group, you have to meet a certain set of defined characteristics. For example, let's say there is a bounded group where the defining characteristic is a bald head. Now, if you're bald, you get to be in the group. If you're not, you don't. So Dwayne Johnson is in. Big hair bands from the 1980s are out. Sorry, Bon Jovi. Now, not to split hairs. I know. The dad joke is strong in me. But what about when things aren't so clear? What if, like Sinead O'Connor, you shave your head? Does that count? Or what if you look like Sean Connery? He was bald on the top of his head, but not on the side. Ultimately, it's up to the group. They get to define the standards of who's in and who's out. Taking this example, we can pull back and see how the idea of bounded groups plays itself out in a more important way. Let's start with two of the biggest bounded groups in our culture today, Republicans and Democrats. While there are nuances in how people see and understand these groups, there are some basic characteristics that most of us can define for each of them. I would argue that right now the boundaries defining these groups are as firmly set as they have ever been. And more people see themselves and others as either in or outside of them without much room for nuance. As the norms in these groups develop, sometimes their boundaries get more and more firm. And as they do, the groups move further and further apart. This tendency increases the us versus them mentality that is a root cause of the extreme polarization we are seeing today. Of course, politics are not the only thing that can lead to bounded groups. There are a lot of issues that can cause people to draw hard lines regarding who's right and who's wrong. For example, pro-choice and pro-life, gun rights and gun control, more LGBTQ plus rights and fewer LGBTQ plus rights, Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter, evangelical and non-evangelical. The list goes on. To be clear, there are times we all need to be with people who have similar experiences and viewpoints as our own. There is nothing wrong with that. It only becomes a problem when we start building boundaries based on the belief that our group is right and theirs is wrong on all matters. That you are either with me or against me. That you are my friend or you are my enemy. When that happens, bounded groups can become so wrapped up in their own identity and ideals that those things not only define who they are and how they live, but how they think others should live as well. These bounded groups are nothing new. In fact, one of the clearest examples of a bounded group was the church into which Jesus was born. The Jewish faith at that time had some very clear boundaries, including laws, traditions, ethnicity, diet, and purity. While all of these were important, at the heart of their bounded group was the need to adhere to the law. They believed that the more perfect you could be in adhering to that law, the more perfect you were in God's eyes. Their boundaries were extremely firm. Not only were they meant to keep people out, but they were also meant to keep people in. They saw everyone outside the boundaries as a threat, believing that even being around them could defile your faith. But then Jesus came along. Over and over and over again, he went beyond the boundaries of the laws. He ate with sinners and tax collectors. He touched lepers. He spent time with the foreigners, the non-Jewish, and even the enemy. This drove the religious leaders at the center of their bounded community crazy, because they believed that what he was doing was sinful and that he was encouraging others to break religious laws. At one point, they even tried to trap him by asking a question rooted in bounded thinking. Which commandment is the greatest? To which Jesus replied, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." This was a massive shift in thinking. Jesus was saying that the law of love for God and for others supersedes any of the laws that were once seen as essential. So it was more important to love those outside the walls of their bounded community than to stay protected within those walls. We often forget that Jesus did not intend to start a new faith, but to reform his own faith. At the center of that reformation was the effort to break down the walls of their legalistic, bounded community and begin to live in a way that more accurately reflected God's plan for humankind. And that leads to the idea of what Hiebert called a centered group. While a bounded group forms a wall that defines who is in and who is out, a centered group is built upon a central idea or belief. Members of a centered group are not defined by who is in or who is out, but how they are moving in relationship to that central ideal. For Jesus, the principle that was supposed to be at the center of faith is found in that passage we read a moment ago. That the commandment to love God and to love each other supersedes all other laws. So, for example, while each of these groups were outside the walls of the bounded church, as long as they were moving toward loving God and loving others, Jesus welcomed them as part of the faith. As for the Pharisees, no matter how central they may have been to the bounded group, if they were putting any law over the commandment to love, then they were moving away from the center, which put them outside the group. While the goal is to be as close to the center as possible, membership is not defined by proximity to the center. It's defined by which way we're moving in relationship to that center. As long as we love God and love each other, even if we do so imperfectly, we are in the group. But even if we follow all the rules of our faith, if we are not living in loving relationships towards others, we're out. Because of the lack of defined boundaries of who's in and who's out, centered groups allow for a diversity that bounded groups do not. For example, again, speaking in broad categories, let's take conservative and progressive Christians. When operating as bounded groups, each of these bodies have beliefs and practices that define who is in and who is out. They may also see each other as not really having the right kind of faith. But in a centered approach, those walls fall away, and people who identify with either group can be working toward the same goal in ways that do not exclude the other. Each group may understand what it looks like to love God and our neighbors differently, but if both groups are moving toward that goal faithfully and without hostility toward or in ways that harm others, they're both in. Now, some of you might be thinking, what about God's truths? Aren't there some absolute truths that we have to hold on to in order to be Christian? Well, the answer to that is yes. But again, there is no law or commandment that is greater than the law of love. That absolute truth is above all others. There are some who believe that strict laws and rules are an expression of love, that we have to make sure people get things right, that they behave or believe in a certain way so that they don't miss out on the promises of faith. This kind of tough love approach is a very dangerous and slippery slope. And we have to be really careful about our declarations regarding what is essential in order for a person to be a true Christian. The reality is that people often draw hard lines about requirements of faith that don't impact or benefit them, while at the same time being very flexible and forgiving about any rules that impact or don't benefit them. Of course, that is religious hypocrisy. To be clear, this does not mean that anything goes. We are not talking about cheap grace here. It also doesn't mean that you can't share your beliefs, your interpretation, or your understanding of faith. You can do that all you want. But the moment you begin to demand others to fit in your model in order to be included, you are no longer a centered group, but a bounded one. So, as long as these two groups are sharing the same center, they are both equal parts of the body of Christ, and neither gets to say that the other doesn't belong. Taking this a bit further, it also means some of the divisions that can exist among bounded Christian groups no longer threaten us, because as long as any group, no matter how differently they may see their faith, as long as they are living into the commandment to love God and love others, they are in the group. And so, just as those who affiliate as conservative or progressive Christians can be equal parts of the body, so can Republican Christians and Democratic Christians. So can LGBTQ plus and non-LGBTQ plus Christians, as well as evangelical and non-evangelical Christians. Again, to be clear, if you affiliate with any one of these groups or the many others that we could include, you can disagree with one another as long as you are doing so in a loving, welcoming way that gives them the same rights and privileges of community that you have. In short, as long as you love them as you love yourself. But the moment you demean or dehumanize someone else or demand that they have to do it your way or face exclusion, you're no longer moving toward the center. Instead, you become a modern-day Pharisee. And Jesus said we can't be doing that. Friends, a diverse church in a divided world is not easy. It takes work. But God created the church to be diverse by design. And one of the reasons God did so is because the world beyond our doors is diverse. The church is meant to serve as a model for what it looks like to live into God's hope and plan for the world. If the church can't be a reconciled community, how can the church be a reconciling presence beyond our doors? And God knows the world needs a reconciling presence right now. So let's be that presence. Let's show the world what it looks like to be the church that God intended us to be. Let's love God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and let's love our neighbor as ourselves. Even that neighbor. Amen.